As a tourist or a local in India, do you ever feel like, why is India like this? The fourth largest economy in the world is filthy. In a symbolic as well as literal sense, it has pothole-filled roads, a public transport system that is crumbling, government schools that you wouldn't ever dream of sending your child to, terrible drainage, and a fantastic law and order system that only seems to work if you happen to have money. This is what China looks like 100 years apart. On the other hand, we have Japan 50 years after the bombing, but India looks somewhat like this after 70 years of independence. But why is it like that? Why are we so far behind? Several people claim that all of India's problems stem from one thing, its high population. But our neighbor has the same amount of population, and despite that, they have clean roads, government schools that actually seem to be working, and good drainage. Today we try to understand what is it about India that makes everyone think, what's wrong with this country? As always, with the help of data and evidence. The reason why India and China have such a huge disparity in terms of progress, despite having similar problems and a population size, was perfectly described in this 2003 book called The Future of Freedom by the American journalist Fareed Zakaria. The author says that most of the countries we observe in the modern world that are successful became democracies after they were successful. However, the reason why a country like India struggles today is because it adopted democracy before it was ready. He calls a country like India an illiberal democracy, meaning the terrible state that we are in today has more to do with the nature of our democracy as opposed to our population size. And I have solid data to prove this. Let's start by looking at two distinct examples from the Indian state of Maharashtra. 8% of the entire state lives below the poverty line, and 51% of them depend on agriculture as their primary source of income. Now, it isn't exactly a high-paying job and only contributes to 11% of the entire state's economy, and as a result, the state of farmers is really terrible, especially the smaller ones. The issue of farmers committing suicide due to poverty is so widespread in Maharashtra that in the first quarter of 2025, a farmer gave his life every 3 hours in the state. However, instead of getting to the root of the problem, the state government came up with a scheme for an entirely different section of the population. They started offering 1500 rupees every single month direct cash into the bank accounts of weak, marginalized women. No irrigation scheme, no water grids, no sustainable solutions, but $4 billion was spent in transfer payments to women, money that would very likely not even last them 2 days. Why? Because poor women made up 25 million voters, while poor farmers with a lot of debt made up a few 100,000. And in the end, votes are what win you elections. But wait, it's not like these women didn't know that this wasn't sustainable and that this money wouldn't last them for a long time. So why did they still vote for it or even enroll for this scheme? The answer lies in income inequality and dynamics of India. Currently, the bottom 50% of Indians only earn 15% of the entire country's income. The average Indian is so poor that on a per capita income level, the country ranks 136th of all the countries in the world. Now, if people don't have the basic stuff sorted like food and shelter, do you think they worry about things like cleanliness and roads? Obviously not. If you were in their place, you too would have taken that 1500 rupees. Now, this group of people make a significantly larger vote bank. On the other hand, let's say a high income earner in the city who actually has the luxury and the privilege to think long term doesn't make up as big of a vote bank. And hence, if a government wants to stay in power, they have no option but to cater to the largest vote bank possible as soon as possible, and hence short term solutions get prioritized over long term solutions. I'll give you another fantastic example. What we just saw was a case of freebies and unsustainable solutions taking away real development. There are also other instances where the government observes actual development occurring in the private sector, but it deliberately slows it down in order to retain another vote bank. Consider the case of auto rickshaws and cab drivers in the city of Mumbai. Getting a ride here is no joke. You have to beg 5 to 6 of them to do the unthinkable. Their job. If you want to go somewhere close by, they'd refuse you because they want a higher fare. If you want to go somewhere far away, they'd refuse you because it's too far. Or they'll say yes and demand a higher fare. So a company came here called Rapido that brought an interesting solution. They said there's so many people in India that use two-wheelers, so if there's one person willing to take you from point A to point B, you can pay that person and travel at the back of their two-wheeler. Basically like Uber but for bikes. It solved a lot of problems, and as someone born and raised in Mumbai, it was the best thing that happened to me. This was so convenient that it decreased the demand for autos and taxis, and naturally their unions got really mad at Rapido. So now the government stepped in and told these unions that look, if a passenger asks you to go from point A to point B and if you say no, there's obviously someone else who's going to come in and offer that solution, so you deal with it. Just kidding. None of this happened. The government sided with these unions and shut Rapido down for a couple of months. After this point, they let Rapido operate but introduced a very complicated policy that made a bike taxi registration as expensive and as time consuming as an auto and taxi registration, making the entire process worse for all the stakeholders involved. Why did they act this way? Because they know that auto and taxi unions are extremely organized, they have the potential to shut a city down if they wished, and most importantly, they are a vote bank. Look at this. The government reported that Mumbai had one toilet for every 46 men and one for every 38 women. However, an NGO called Praja Foundation decided to investigate this. They found that in reality there was one toilet for every 752 men and one for every 1820 women. And as a person who lives here, I can confirm this. I've been stuck in traffic countless times wanting to pee. I look up public toilets on Google Maps. I find 5 of them, 4 of them don't exist, and the 5th one is locked. But instead of fixing this, the government decided to investigate the NGO because they seem to defame the government. This way, every decision becomes a short-term one. Politicians start optimizing for popularity and reputation. Democracy takes 100% priority as opposed to progress. But wait, China is on the other end of the spectrum, wherein democracy takes 0% priority as opposed to progress, which takes 100%. Because in China, keeping your power and getting re-elected is the least concern. There is only one party and one leader. So does that mean India should also adopt a model like this? Obviously not. What India should do is a completely different story, and we will discuss solutions at the end of this video. But before that, let's explore what other countries did. Going back to what Fareed Zakaria said about being successful before you could become a democracy, South Korea is a fantastic example. Under the leadership of Park Chung-hee, for almost 20 years, it was a semi-authoritarian regime that rapidly industrialized. Once it had a strong middle class, it slowly transitioned into a democracy. As people's incomes grew, they had the luxury to be able to think long-term and vote for long-term solutions that are sustainable. Taiwan, on the other hand, did something similar. It was ruled by one party, the Kuomintang, for 20 years, and it rapidly grew its middle class before transitioning slowly into a democratic process. Singapore, on the other hand, followed a model called meritocratic autocracy, wherein there would only be one government with absolute power, but the only criteria when it came to shaping policy or doing business would be merit. Even today, if you bring growth and money to the Singaporean economy, you would do well in that country. Vote banks and identity-based politics did not matter. Contrast this to India, where even today votes are being sought in the name of gender identity and race. And you must understand that most of these problems are here to stay as long as the majority of India remains poor. So what's the way ahead now? Does that mean India should transition to a dictatorship till its incomes go up? Obviously not. India doesn't need lesser democracy. Maybe it did 70 years ago. What it needs now is better democracy. And that can be achieved with a couple of sensible solutions. First is smarter welfare. Freebie culture would never end in India as long as there is poverty, but there's a better way of doing it, like Brazil's Bolsa Familia program. Like the Maharashtra government, they too gave free money to their citizens, but under 2 conditions. First, you had to have a minimum attendance at school, and second, you had to get your vaccines on time. This way, they were able to lift more people out of terrible conditions in a sustainable manner, because now these people were taking actions that were good for them. Don't just give 1500 rupees for free, give it with purpose. The second solution is to decentralize. Another huge problem India has is that we elect our members of parliament and our members of the legislative assembly, but it's not their job to clean our streets or make sure that the drainage system is working properly. This responsibility lies with your local body, which has neither the authority, money, or the manpower to solve these problems, but they know the problems best. And what makes this even worse is that the head of this local body is a person not elected by you. It's someone appointed by the state government who has no idea what's going on there. Decentralizing, giving real power to the local bodies and ensuring that the people who work here are elected officials could be a step in the right direction. Another advantage of elections at the local level is that it's harder to find a vote bank. Across India, at the national level, you'd find many vote banks, but at the zonal level or at the ward level, it becomes difficult to do this, and hence what speaks for you is your work. The third thing is to clean up the elections, making the Election Commission of India stronger and cracking down on the sources of campaign financing. Even today, poor voters in India are given free food and alcohol in exchange for votes, and the worst part is that it works. If you made it this far, I'd love to know how you think this problem could be solved. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you learned something new from this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.